Hello, everyone. Welcome. Well, Happy New Year. First of all, I know we're here January 23rd, but haven't seen everyone since last month. So Happy New Year. I hope everyone had a great holiday season, and your new year, 3 weeks in here, has been successful. As always, welcome to the monthly virtual tasting for Eureka Whiskey Club. Really excited to be joined by two awesome gentlemen from Westland tonight, and we'll get into intros here in a second. We got a couple of great prizes to give away, but yeah, just thank you everyone for being a member and tuning in tonight to talk all things Westland. Marshall, you wanna go first and introduce yourself to everybody, and then Matt can follow.
Sure, yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Marshall Altier, and I represent the distillery of Westland here in the great state of California. So happy to be here with you today. I've been with the company for just a couple of years now, about 2 years, but been a big fan for a long time. And so been living the dream here, working with Westland in this exciting, new category of American single malt whiskey. So happy to be here with you today.
And what is your title, Marshall?
I'm sorry, Regional Distillery Ambassador is the title.
Oh, awesome. And then we are honored to be joined by the man himself, Matt Hoffman. Matt, you want to tell everyone, you do something over there, right? Right?
Yeah. These days I do a lot of spreadsheets, but no, my name is Matt Hoffman. I am one of the co-founders of Westland. We started the business back in 2010, which now that it's 2023 seems like a long time ago. And I started as the master distiller on the production side, but also I oversee the whole business now as the managing director. Still have my hands in the production side though, so doing a lot.
Yeah, Matt. I think we've been working with you guys close to since the beginning.
Yeah, for sure.
Carrying the products in our restaurant. So we've been doing this club now for about 3 years. So I'm excited to finally have you guys featured, and huge props to Marshall for tracking me down. I know it can be a hard person to get straight answers from, and he did a great job in setting this all up. So excited to start talking about all things Westland. Before we get into that, I do want to just highlight, as always, a couple great prizes that Marshall and Matt and the Westland team have put together for us to give away on the call tonight. We have a signed bottle by Mr. Matt Hoffman himself of the distillery exclusive release of their 10-year anniversary whiskey. And Marshall, you want to tell us a little bit about that specific offering?
Yeah, I'll let Matt tell you a little bit more about Deacon Seat, because this is a pretty special thing, and yeah, it has got his signature on it. So I want him to dig into it. It's something very unique that we might never do again. So I want to do it justice.
Yeah. So Deacon Seat is the very first release that we ever put out, which was back in October of 2013. We put out this product that we called Deacon Seat. It was a one-off. And so we're up here in Seattle, and there's a lot of logging and lumber history behind it, being in the Pacific Northwest. And this idea of the Deacon Seat came from kind of logging history, where when people would go out into the woods, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they'd cut down a big tree, kind of split it in half lengthwise, and lay those, flat slabs, like flat side up, and then that first tree and slab would be their dinner table. It would be their bed. It would be like where they would gamble. It was like the center around which they built the rest of the logging camp. And that story we thought was a really cool concept for, like, this is the first thing that we are doing as a new distillery. And we're going to build everything else around that. So that was the original release in 2013. But we were getting to this point where we were coming up on the 10-year anniversary of our first distillation at scale, which was in 2011. And we said, now's an opportunity to do this again. And we only did 400 bottles of this to give you an idea of the rarity of it. And the whole idea, even back in the original Deacon Seat 2013, and then this one we just did in 2011 was it's a time capsule for the future. So it's what are the things that we're most excited about that we have in our stocks that represent where we're going. So in the bottle is a combination of things that we've never released before anywhere else as a whiskey, in terms of some of the new varieties of barley we're really excited about. Gary Oak, which is a local oak species in the Northwest, wine casks and things like that. So it's a hyper like custom blend for 400 bottles, and it included we like literally wrote a book for it that included a bunch of like essays and quasi philosophical editorials on how we kind of view our time in the world. So it was a really like high effort one-off piece, but something we were really excited by. So it's cool to be able to offer this up tonight.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm super jealous if whoever ever wins that bottle. And then, second prize, we got an awesome swag bag to give away with, I think, that coffee table book and some socks and just a bunch of other cool stuff from Westland. So as always, questions are highly encouraged. We will get to everyone's questions at the end of the call, and then we'll choose the best two of the night. And I will have the tough job of choosing the first place and second place winners here. But awesome. Thank you, both of you, very much for supplying those great prizes for us to give away to our members this evening. So let's just dive right into it. Matt, can you just tell us about your history in the beverage world and what led you to opening up Westland and kind of just the history and ideology behind the brand?
Boy, my history in the beverage world it's not extensive.
We don't have one night, so
yeah. Well, luckily the history is actually quite short because I started Westland. I co-founded Westland when I was 21 years old. I started distilling when I was in college, which is, in hindsight, like completely ridiculous. I was running a still out of my dorm, and not just because like who distills like in a dorm room, but also I was really interested in flavor growing up, and I think maybe in another life I could have been a chef. But to me, the beautiful thing about whiskey is it's 4 ingredients, right? It's especially single malt whiskey. It's malted barley, yeast for fermentation, water, and then oak casks. And I was just absolutely enraptured by the idea that these 4 ingredients would make one of the most complex beverages on the planet, and that's still a really compelling idea to me. So I started at University of Washington, where I was distilling in my dorm room, eventually dropped out, enrolled in a postgrad program in brewing distilling science. Despite not having my undergrad, they let me in anyway, in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Scotland. And that's where I learned kind of the mechanics of what we were trying to do, the real kind of at a high level professionally making single malt whiskey. But everything that they were teaching there was, it's Scotland, and Scotland, they do a great job of making single malt whiskey, but they do things in a particular way, in a particular style. And my goal was never to copy Scottish whiskey. It was to kind of build on some of the things that the history was there that are important to continue, but also like I want to make a Pacific Northwest single malt whiskey. And the reason why we make single malt whiskey at all instead of bourbon. Now, if y'all are watching this and you think, well, you're an American distillery and you should be making bourbon, this is a big country. And we are up in Seattle. We're as far away from corn country as you can get. This is one of the few places in America that doesn't grow corn. And in fact, is one of the best barley growing climates in the world. It is, in fact, believe it or not, better for growing barley than Scotland is. So for us, it was quite natural to make single malt whiskey. That kind of love of whiskey in history came together with this idea that all the barley could be sourced locally. We have all sorts of other influences as well. And that combined with the Scottish background led me and my co-founder to starting Westland back in 2010.
Awesome. I can't believe you were making whiskey in your dorm room. Did you?
Yeah, me too, man. I mean,
or was it what were you making whiskey or what distillate was it?
No, I was making junk. Um, uh, no, this in the early,
Was it consumable junk? Or was
yeah, yeah. I mean, depends on your definition of consumable.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't
Yeah, I
exactly
mean,
kill you.
yeah, the statute of limitations has passed, right? I guess we're gonna find out. No, I mean, joking aside, I mean, I was really interested in the flavor aspect of it. When I was starting, I was trying to, what can you ferment? And you start kind of with like table sugar and stuff like that, and then went to kind of fruit juices and stuff like that. But after my freshman year of college, I bought some homebrewing equipment. I actually see some notes in the chat about homebrewing experience. So I'm seeing your questions come in, guys. And so I was kind of learning, there's a strong homebrewing culture, of course, in Seattle. So I was learning that way and teaching myself because the process in terms of getting from the grain, at least to the fermentation, is very similar to brewing. It's not exactly the same, but it's really, really similar. And the equipment is definitely the same. So I was doing that kind of when I was 19, and then kind of from there on, it was just whiskey.
So you were either really popular or you were the guy that's room smelled really weird and no one wanted to go into it.
Yeah, how about both?
Both.
That's good to hear. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about. I think we're coming up on 3 years as a club, and this is only the second time we featured an American single malt in the club. It's probably been a little bit over a year since the last time we did it. So can you talk to us a little bit about like what is American single malt and how it is similar and how it differs from Scotch?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is a great time to be doing American single malt because we're like literally on the cusp of history right now, which I'll explain in a second. But quite simply, there is a movement of distillers in this country. I mean, there's people in this country making everything. There's 3,000 distilleries in this country, but there's a big movement of distilleries making single malt whiskey, which started all the way back in the early 90s with either Steve McCarthy at Clear Creek or who am I? I'm blanking on Dave and George, St. George Spirits.
St. George.
So it kind of started there with a few distilleries making single malts. And the whole idea, of course, with single malt is single means one distillery, and malt being 100% malted barley, which really got more popular in Scotland in like the 80s and especially the 90s, where the term single differentiated it from a blend. Now, for us making single malt, there's a lot of us, again, because there's a big brewing influence, a lot of us who got into this were kind of learning about brewing at the same time, where people came over from the brewing world and said, okay, here's this ingredient that we have that is being used in beer, or in my case, like here's this ingredient that grows locally to where I come from, and we could be making this. And it's not in, this country can make bourbon and rye and single malt all very authentically if you believe that whiskey should be connected to agriculture. And now that, it started with a couple of distilleries. We were, I think, the second distillery to be dedicated to making single malt whiskey. So we don't make anything else. We only make single malts. And now there are at least 250 distilleries that I'm aware of making single malts, from the smallest guys, making one cask a year up to, Jack Daniel's just released 2 single malts, which is really extraordinary. And that's great as far as I'm concerned. The pie is getting much bigger. The other big bourbon producers are producing it as well. And we're just now on the cusp of actually getting formal category recognition. So the words on the label, like if you look at the bottle of Westland Sherrywood, it says American single malt whiskey. Well, today those words don't mean anything, but Westland and 8 other distilleries created a definition. It would be like creating the definition for bourbon today, or creating the definition for champagne or cognac or something like that. And we wrote a definition for American single malt, submitted it to the U.S. government, and they've said they're going to release their final ruling on that. This was March of 2016. It was a long time ago. And they're going to issue their final ruling in April of this year, which is a pretty big moment. So as I said, like we are kind of in the cusp of living and making history right now when it comes to American single malt. So what a great time to have this be part of the club.
That's cool. Yeah. And then on everyone's cards this month that we did put the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission and what their requirements are for that. So Matt, are you part of you're part of the founding members of the American Single Malt Commission? Is that correct?
Yeah, it'd be fair to say that it was our idea originally, actually. And we sent out an open invitation to anybody that was making single malt in the US to join us at a spirits conference. And that's where we were joined by 8 other distilleries who were producing single malt. And that group of 8 has now gone to 250. And we have the commission, which is supporting these efforts.
And are you guys pushing for like some type of DO on the phrasing American single malt, or what exactly are you trying to get done?
Well, it's what we call a standard of identity. So a standard of identity is the rule within the TTB structure that gives bourbon its definition that's legally protected by law, and then that is protected in international trade agreements. Now, beyond that, I think there's a lot of possibility for American single malt to differentiate across the country, depending upon regionalities and things like that. But I think it's too early to try to force that in. Right now, all we're trying to do is say, if you make single malt in this country, it has to be mashed, distilled, matured in America, along with being made out of malted barley, one distillery, the rest. This is a category for you. So it's meant to just kind of make sure that when you guys, the whiskey fans, buy a bottle of American single malt, you get what you pay for.
Yeah, because I have seen some distillers release, single malt, but not using malted barley, using rye or and calling it, a single malt whiskey with rye. It sounds like that's something you're trying to make it so that the word American single malt would mean it had to be made with barley.
Yeah, this is kind of illustrative of why this is necessary. I mean, the word single malt whiskey in a lot of countries, in particular the UK and in parts of Europe, are enshrined into law as meaning 100% malted barley. I mean, that's where the idea came from. It's always been malted barley. And in fact, the US already recognizes single malt Scotch whiskey legally as being made from 100% malted barley. So there are a couple of distilleries out there who do make whiskey out of like malted rye, as you say, and the commission in Westland, as well as part of that, is very much in support of the idea. If you make, let's say, something out of 100% malted rye, you could call it American single malt rye whiskey. But the baseline definition for single malt, it's kind of like brandy. Like the baseline definition of brandy, as people understand it and as it exists in law, it means grape brandy.
Yeah.
But for single malt, if it's just going to say American single malt, it should be made out of barley.
Cool. And then is there things that, other than where it's made, I mean, is it or anything that differentiates it from Scotch?
Yeah. So the only main differentiation from Scotch, in fact, part of the point of this is to have the definition largely match the consumer understanding of single malt at a global level, which is underpinned by the definition in Scotland. But the main point of differentiation is that in Scotland, to call something single malt, they have to use pot stills. Now, the reason for that is a really good one, and that is because in Scotland they use pot stills, which retains the character of the grain in the distillate. That's what gives single malt whiskey its character, as opposed to like grain whiskey, which is what's used in blends, Johnny Walkers, and what have you, where that's distilled to 94% ABV, has very, very little flavor, but is used to bulk out blends and is what makes blends cheaper than malts. And so their idea was single malt should be made from pots because you can't use pot stills to make grain whiskey. It's financially impossible. So again, the underpinning of that is really good. But in America, we're much more free historically to use all sorts of different still types. And in our most important whiskey definitions to date, bourbon whiskey and straight rye whiskey, there's already precedent for accomplishing the same thing, but with a different mechanism. So in America, like for bourbon whiskey, you have to distill it to no more than 80% alcohol by volume. And that ensures that what you distill isn't pure ethanol and therefore retains the character coming from the mash, the grain, things like that. But it allows you to use any still type, which is, and there's three. There's pot stills, column continuous stills, and hybrids of those two systems. So we wanted to have both of these, all three of these systems in there, so that if you're using any type of still in America, you should be able to make single malt, and yet you can still retain that flavor coming from the grain. So that's really the only, besides the America part, major differentiator from the Scottish definition.
Cool. So I want to talk about a lot of the wood that you guys use, because I know that's a big pride point of Westland. Can you talk a little bit about kind of you're sourcing your barley there locally, but you're also sourcing a lot of wood as well for your barrels. Can you tell our members a little bit more about the type of wood that you use to age the whiskey?
Yeah. So besides the sherry casks that have gone into the sherry wood expression, which we'll get to later, I'm sure. A lot of what we've done is new American oak casks. I also see somebody's got that question up in the chat. Now that's new American oak casks. So when we say American oak, we mean, well, I guess it's not legally defined, but in practice, it's the American white oak, the Quercus alba, and that grows in the eastern half of the country. So new charred oak casks. That is required for bourbon. It's required for straight rye whiskey. But in Scotland, that was actually illegal to do until 12 years ago. And then they opened it up and allowed them to innovate. The whole idea was everybody is making, with bourbon, they're using new casks, and then those casks go to Scotland, they go to Ireland, they go to Canada, Japan, etc. So with American single malt, we thought it was important that, new American oak is part of the flavor profile of American whiskeys. And in general, we believe that it should be a part of the definition. So in the way that we use American oak at Westland, it's both new American oak and used American oak. But about 50% of what we fill is new charred American oak. And what we do with that is slow grown oak and air dried wood. So both of those things are kind of higher levels of quality that basically are typically only used for wine barrels. They usually cost double or triple what a typical bourbon cask costs, but the quality is much improved, the mouthfeel and things like that. Really, really important. So we use a mixture of, that's kind of like the foundation, the new American oak. Then we have sherry casks. We have a little bit of refill bourbon casks. We have some local wine and beer casks too, but then we also have casks made of Gary oak, which is a species that is local to the Pacific Northwest. And basically it runs on the I-5 corridor, more or less from Vancouver, BC. I was just up there yesterday, in Victoria, for Victoria Whiskey Fest, down through Seattle, where we are here, through Portland, Willamette Valley, and into Northern California. And it's only, this 50-mile wide ribbon of land. And what's cool about that is it's only the 5th species of white oak used in the world to make whiskey. And it's right here, like literally there's one in my front yard. And that's an amazing thing to be able to bring to the world of whiskey. And we say we want to make an American single malt, but also we have this Pacific Northwest influence of this is a tree that has a completely unique flavor profile and only grows here. So we use all of these things. We range from the more traditional to the kind of more traditional American and more traditional Scottish, but also the more innovative and more local to the Pacific Northwest.
Awesome. And then speaking of kind of locally sourced things, you stated that you source all of your grain from the Pacific Northwest. Do you find that the climate in the Pacific Northwest produces different flavor profiles than grain that would be sourced out of Scotland for Scotch, and what would the differences be?
Oh, sure. We're at 90% Washington State sourced. The rest is there's a little bit coming from Wisconsin and a little bit coming from the UK at this point, but we should be at 100% locally sourced Washington State by 2024. So the answer to that is not only is there a difference between Washington State and Scotland, even Washington State does not have one consistent growing region. So we actually source from two main growing regions. One is what we call the Palouse. The Palouse is on the Washington, Idaho, Oregon border. That is, if anybody remembers was it Windows XP that has like the rolling green hills or whatever, the Microsoft logo, like that's the Palouse actually. It's also one of the biggest wheat growing areas in the world. It's a great dryland grain growing region, but it's what we call a continental climate. So just like anywhere east of the Cascade Mountains, from 50 miles east of Seattle all the way over to the east coast of the U.S. is a continental climate. Hot, humid summers, cold winters. Barley grows there in a very different way than Scotland, which is more wet and more humid. So about 60% of the barley comes from the Palouse, and then we have the rest coming from west of the Cascades, and that's a region called the Skagit Valley, and that's kind of its maritime climate. It's actually technically considered a Mediterranean climate because we have a cold, wet winter, but it's not freezing, and then a dry summer. And barley is actually a Mediterranean crop, and so this is when I say like it's actually better than Scotland. Like Scotland doesn't, much to their pain every time I talk to them about it, like they don't have a summer, it's just still wet. But it's a really nice like ripening period for barley. So it gives us two different characteristics. And even within that, from field to field, from variety to variety, we're actually getting ready to use our 27th different variety of barley, which is more than all of Scotland put together. There's so much variation there that's like literally overwhelming. Yes, there's differentiation from Scotland, but we're also playing with other variations in terms of field to field terroir variations and different varietals. And when I say varietals, I mean like if y'all are familiar, Cabernet Sauvignon versus Merlot versus Pinot Noir, these are varieties of grapes. The same concept exists in barley, but it's basically unexplored.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about the sherry wood.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, this is the last release of this brand.
It is.
So we were really excited to bring this to our members because I love this whiskey. Been a fan for quite a long time, and I really wanted to make sure we were able to introduce people to this before it goes away.
Yeah, sherrywood is it's a bummer that it has to go away, but it's going away for a good reason, and that is because sourcing. So sherrywood is us. We're using sherry wine casks, and it's coming from Spain. So these are the old school traditional wine casks. They're 80 to 100 years old. That the problem with that as an industry that we all have is that sourcing those casks is fundamentally economically unsustainable. It has nothing to do with environmental sustainability, but these sherry bodegas in Spain, the reason why people were using sherry casks to begin with is because 150 years ago, people loved sherry and they were transporting sherry by the cask into the UK, bottling it up and said, well, we've got these casks, now we've got this junk called, whiskey, and let's put the whiskey in these casks to make it taste like the sherry that we all love. And now everything is reversed. Everybody loves, whiskey. And so the demand for sherry casks to mature whiskey is actually far higher than the demand for sherry itself. And the only reason that we as an industry are able to get sherry casks today, and this is not even 100% true anymore, is when wineries are going out of business, because a bodega, sherry winery, will keep that cask forever, like literally until it falls apart, 100 to 150 years. And so they don't get rid of casks, they just use them until they fall apart. And so when we get them, that means a sherry bodega downsized or was going out of business. Now, a number of larger brands have gotten around that by making sherry to flavor casks like with the traditional flavor profile. And there's a grade of sherry that is allowed to be used, not commonly known, but a grade of sherry that is allowed to be made and legally called sherry in Spain that can flavor barrels, but then you're not allowed to bottle it because it's not of the right quality. And that kind of got us to this point where, like, you know, we're not so dependent on sherry casks with like the big history of Westland, you know, like there are for distilleries that have been around for 200 years. So we can afford, as casks have gotten harder and harder to source, we kind of said we can afford to be more selective about, we get casks when they come in, let's get the traditional kind. But that means as we grow, we can't sustain having a product called Sherrywood in our lineup as a core SKU anymore, because we don't get to pick the exact amount of casks that were coming in terms of the right ratio of Oloroso to PX and things like that. So we're still like able to source sherry casks, but we're now doing so in a way that is, we're not building the core portfolio of our whiskey around it. It's going to be a much more limited part of what we have going forward, which is in alignment with basically how rare the casks are. Frankly, they're real casks. And so Sherrywood, as much as we all love it, you know, it's getting this kind of proper send off here, and is made from these old traditional sherry wine casks. So I'm glad you guys were able to get it.
And what sherry finishing, you know, just if in a quick nutshell, what flavor profiles is that really adding to the whiskey?
So we use two different types of sherry casks in Sherrywood. So we use Oloroso and PX. Oloroso, what we're using there is a dry Oloroso. So that's going to give us some like stewed fruits, kind of dry, nutty, like almond sort of notes. But there's no sugar in it. It's a dry palate. The PX is literally made from raisinated grapes. So Pedro Jimenez grapes, which are then ripened or raisined in the sun, they press that hyper sweet. So you get these raisin notes, but you also get some really cool like mole poblano notes a little bit, like, which I just absolutely love. You know, there's this kind of savory element to it, you know, dark chocolates and stuff like that. So what makes our Sherrywood unique is that we have a very high ratio relative to the industry of PX to Oloroso. It's a 50-50 ratio. Most distilleries are using like 10% PX to 90% Oloroso. And PX is a big, really flavorful type of cask, being made from these raisins.
PX is Pedro Jimenez, right?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. PX stands for Pedro Jimenez. And so that by itself makes it very unique. But, you know, a part of what we do, and I didn't even explain this at the beginning, was the way that we look at malt is as a source of flavor. Most distilleries are kind of just looking at it as a big source of yield, whereas we take the beer approach and we find types of malt that can make, you know, really interesting beers, and we make whiskey out of that. So in the Sherrywood expression, there's 5 different types of malted barley. 4 of them are roasted, and this brings this really nice nutty, chocolatey pastry flavor to the table. And then that complements the PX in the sherry casks, in the Sherrywood. So you kind of get this different style of sherry cask whiskey with our Sherrywood expression. It's, to me, you get like it's like stewed fruit syrup over pancakes on the nose, and then like oatmeal raisin cookie on the palate.
Yeah.
So it's a very different type of sherry cask expression. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely get a ton of the stewed fruit. Oatmeal raisin cookie, I feel like it just pops, and then some of that maple, it really comes through as well. I love sherry finish whiskeys. Actually, when I'm going to segue into kind of this next thing here, but when we first started working with you guys, I actually was fortunate enough to go up there and select a barrel. And Matt, I think you were the one that showed me around, or yeah, that's right. And we went in your little lab, and it's like every type of cask. It was like this Willy Wonka esque kind of thing, where it was just like what do you want to taste? And I remember selecting a Pedro Jimenez sherry cask finished whiskey that we sold at the restaurants for a long time. And I think I'm pretty sure it was cask 311.
Yeah,
That's right.
And you guys were nice enough to put my name on it. And I was like, whoa, wow. That was my name on a bottle of whiskey. That's pretty cool. But I highly recommend, if you have not gone to the distillery, you know, it's probably one of the but you know, at this time I wasn't able to go up and go to that lovely room that I was in before, but Marshall was able to send me some samples of some whiskeys, and of course, the sucker I am for sherry, I ended up choosing a Pedro Jimenez finished sherry cask, which and you know, kind of announced, this is the first time we've announced it to all our members. We did give our members that have been in the club for everyone over 2 years got a little bit of heads up on this, but we do have a cask strength single cask single malt whiskey finished in Pedro Jimenez, available for sale to our Whiskey Club members exclusively at the restaurant. And I believe it's 118.8 proof. But Marshall, can you tell us a little bit more about that barrel we selected?
Yeah, this one's really cool because it's one of the few that we released last year, which is not a finish and didn't really see New American Oak. It's all in PX Hogshead for 7 years, so it's a very unique one. Unlike the 5 malt blend that Matt touched on earlier, it's a single barley varietal, which is Pilsen, which is a pretty crisp barley variety of so it's this one's unique. You're not going to see anything like this from Westland on the market.
Yeah, so
it's really delicious. I can't wait to come and have some.
That's available at Eureka's for our Whiskey Club members to purchase if you're a fan of this and kind of want something that's a little bit stronger and kind of just more unique. I definitely recommend going and picking up a bottle, and we're selling those for $100 each, and go get them. They're
unique, and not to fear for those of you who are worried about not being able to get any sherry whiskey from Westland again. Trevor has our new flagship SKU in I think all of the Eureka locations, and that has a really good amount of Oloroso oak still going on, in addition to that New American Oak that Matt described, and a little touch of peated whiskey. So it's an even more, I think, complex whiskey. It's still the 5 malt blend that you're getting in the sherry wood. It's still Belgian saison yeast. It's still non-caramel colored and non-chill filtered, and all the things that we consider to be kind of signatures of Westland's house style at this point. So I think that's important to note. It's not completely gone forever, but this particular expression, this is the end of it. So I'll miss it too. It's I find that between the peated and the American Oak and the sherry woods that we sold prior, everybody kind of has a favorite child, so to speak, and a lot of people love that sherry wood and are going to miss it a lot. So hope everybody is enjoying it.
Yeah, get it while you can.
That's right.
And then while we were talking, I went ahead and made this
nice,
delicious cocktail that Marshall was kind enough to share with us, and it's kind of a riff on a perfect Manhattan, but with single malt. And we are the Affinity. Is that right, Marshall?
Yeah, this is an old classic. I think it shows up in the Savoy cocktail book from 1930, if I remember correctly. And it's really just like you said, a perfect Rob Roy or a perfect Manhattan using single malt. It really just, I think, shows off the kind of richness of the whiskey, but still nice and dry, nothing too sweet with the bitters and the dry vermouth. I saw you using Via there from California as well, which is delicious. Yeah. So yeah, very nice.
Yeah. So cheers, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Sipping on whiskey, you're making the cocktail at home. Absolutely delicious. So before we get into questions, one of these things that we kind of talked about, we're constantly trying to come up with fun new ideas for the club. And one of the things we talked about is like putting a playlist together. And I know that sounds kind of corny, but I'm a big music person, and I know that people feel passionately about it. So one of the things, and you guys will be the first people I've asked this question of, if you were to pick, and sorry to put you on the spot, hopefully you can think of something, but if you were to pick 2 songs that, or even just one song, but if you can come up with 2, that's great, that would embody the Westland Sherrywood single malt, what would they be?
Oh man, that's a tough one.
That is a tough one. I've never been asked that question before. I mean, I think Sherrywood is a big kind of, it's a bold whiskey, which is an overused term, but it's got a lot of these really like big flavors when it comes to the PX and when it comes to those dark roasted malts. But it's also like this big kind of comfy pillow of a whiskey, you know. It's just like you can just kind of sink right in, you know. So I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I feel like if I were to search for something like that, it would be something that's kind of, you know, it'd be a pretty big, pretty relaxed sort of song that I'd probably try to pair to it, if that kind of makes sense.
Is there a band you can name that we could? Man. I know I'm putting you on the spot here. I should have had you prepare. You know, like
I was thinking Julio Iglesias would be fun. Something layered, something rich. I love this kind of stuff. I'm in on a thing called Music League with friends where we are constantly have these different prompts and coming up with stuff. So I do love this kind of game, but also I need some time to think about it, to be honest.
I did a tasting in Germany. We opened up the German market for Westland back in April, and our ambassador there did a pairing, and he's a huge like music head. He's like used to like design and build custom trumpets and all sorts of crazy stuff. So, and we did this tasting at the Stuttgart State Opera, which is actually pretty highly ranked in the world, and their opera team had a blues band and they paired blues songs with Westland drams, and it's killing me right now because I'm trying desperately to remember which one they paired with Sherrywood, because they did pair one with Sherrywood, and I just can't remember which one it was. I don't know if I could like dig back in my emails here, but that was just super, super cool. What a fun event that was.
That sounds super cool. Yeah. Well, I will follow up with you guys. We'll get your answers later, and then
I like this challenge though. Yeah.
We're gonna potentially work on a whiskey club playlist. You know, every month choosing songs that embody the whiskey. If I were to choose a song for this whiskey, nobody's gonna know this artist, but there's an album I've been listening to recently from a band called Moxie the Band, and there's a song that's called "The Feeling of Letting Go," and I feel like just it's appropriate because we're kind of like letting go of the sherry cask, and it's kind of got this like 80s kind of synthy upbeat thing going on to it that I'm kind of relating to this beautiful, bright, perfect Manhattan here. So
love it.
But I'm going to get answers from you guys, and we're going to work on that playlist so that we can share with our members.
I'm down.
But all right, we're going to move on to the question and answer portion of this. So we already got quite a few good questions here, and we'll just dive right into it. Sean Branham asks, he wants to know about kind of the water of the Pacific Northwest and how that affects the distilling process, and if it's, you know, any challenges or benefits to that.
Well, first of all, every distillery says they have the best water in the world. That's a universal truth. But I'm pretty sure we might have the best water. I mean,
it's better than the water here in LA. So
yeah, I could say that with a pretty good degree of confidence. I mean, look, so what we have here, you know, famously in Seattle, it rains a lot, but actually it doesn't rain as much as people think. There's more rain in New York and most of the East Coast and places like that, but we just get the gray, misty Seattle thing that happens for 9 months. But we also get a huge amount of snowfall in the mountains, the Cascade Mountains to the east, and that provides very, snow melt water throughout the year. It's very clean, very neutral. It's the Cedar River watershed. If anybody really wants to do a deep dive, I believe it's the cleanest, least polluted, and least treated water source for any major metropolitan area in the United States. And so it comes in, it's just very clean and very neutral and low mineral content. And yeast is very happy to work in that environment. Whereas if you go with like a highly alkaline environment, like you have in LA, or like you'd have actually in Kentucky, with high calcium carbonate, that's where like the sour mash method was developed in Kentucky, so that it could work with this high pH water, and sour mashing would lower the pH and to make the yeast a lot happier. Whereas we don't have to do stuff like that because the pH is perfect. So it's I would just call it like a very clean, like blank canvas upon which we can work. And we don't do anything. We don't try to make it be like Scotland or Kentucky or anything like that.
It's a great question. And I think it also speaks to something that Matt kind of alluded to earlier, which is, we have all these things naturally around us that work in our favor to make barley whiskeys, and, beer in particular in Washington as well. So good question.
Awesome. Will Reyes wants to know, how many drams do you have in a day while you check the quality control of your whiskey?
Believe it or not, the novelty of that wears off pretty quick. Yeah, it's tricky, man. I mean, even tasting. So a big thing that we've committed ourselves to, and Trevor, when you were up there, I was still doing the blending at the time, but now we have a dedicated master blender, and I work with him on our new releases, and he's amazing at what he does. But we do everything by nose and palate. So most distilleries get to a point where they're so big where they don't taste everything. Some distilleries still smell every sample. I have a friend of mine who used to be one of the blenders at Macallan, and his job was to smell 500 whiskeys a day, but they would dilute it down to 20% ABV, and he would just kind of sort things by smell. But palate is so important. You're drinking it after all, so like you need to know how it tastes, but that limits what you're able to do. So I'm taking a joking comment and I'm turning it into some real life education here. We do about 5, maybe at most 5 samples or 6 samples in a setting when we taste things, and then your palate kind of needs to reset usually if you want to do it at a professional level. But that's okay. I could still have more drams in the evening,
Yes. Brian Freeland asks, which component of whiskey making do you think is the most important? Raw ingredients, distilling, barrel aging, and then how do you focus on that element?
Great question. I would say, so all of the things are important, which is a cop-out answer. I think it depends on stylistically what you're trying to do. So many distilleries, most distilleries from Scotland would say that it's all about maturation. The often heard quote is 80% of the flavor comes from the cask it's aged in. But that's a choice. That's a way of making whiskey, and you can make wonderful whiskeys that way. But to me, one of the most, and we do make whiskeys that have a lot of that influence, but to me, one of the most underexplored aspects of whiskey making is in fact in the raw ingredients. And that's where what we've done in terms of using dark roasted malts that you'd have in dark beers, the Saison yeast, Marshall touched on that. I had forgot to talk about that earlier, but the Saison yeast we have for fermentation, which provides these nice fruity notes. That's a really big part of it as well. And especially now where we're going is into these different varieties of barley where there's a ton of flavor there. So for us, again, it comes back to it being a choice of what you want to do. And we're really focused on, in terms of where we're going next, in terms of innovation, it's on the raw ingredient flavor.
All right. Matt Archer says, go Sounders. And in your opinion, which finish offers a higher ceiling in terms of market space and or flavor diversity? Sherry barrel finish or peated malt?
Oh, man. Well, in America, there's a bigger market for for sherry casks, I think. And there's a ton of unexplored stuff in sherry casks as well. So actually, one of the things that we are doing, the size of what we're doing with sherry casks has scaled down quite a bit because we're trying to not force a path for these old sherry casks. So we take a few, we can get them, but we have also started to work with some very innovative sherry producers that are approaching sherry in a fundamentally different way, which are kind of like, we're kind of kin in that way. Like we're approaching single malt in a very different way, but they're approaching sherry in a different way. So like one of my favorite ones is a place called Bodegas Robles, which is in, I think they're in Montilla, Spain. So which is PX country. And what they're doing there is they're basically making a PX. Again, Pedro Jimenez is a white grape. So when we taste it, when you look at what's in the sherry wood and the single cask you've got, it's dark and purpley and raisin, but like that comes with time. So what this guy is doing is he's pressing these PX grapes and he's fermenting it and maturing it, but he's not doing the Solera system. So what you get out of this is this kind of really fresh, like Sauterne style of PX, which is super, super cool. And there's very little, I mean, even using PX in general in whiskey is pretty unexplored compared to Oloroso. But then you get into Amontillados, and we did a Fino cask a number of years ago. So there's a ton of space within sherry to innovate. And I think that's where we're, again, because we can be selective now that, sherry wood doesn't need to do so much heavy lifting for us. We can just let the sherry casks come from these really hyper small sources. You'll see those come out from us from time to time in the future, but as single casks and, smaller scale. But peat is also super exciting to explore. And actually one of the things I'm most excited about going forward is we've been working on a project with local peat. We were the first distillery, to the best of my knowledge, to do this. The first batch of peated malt ever commercially made in America was developed by us and our partners at Skagit Valley Malting. First batch commercially made in January 2016, and that whiskey we're going to be releasing in March. I'm super stoked by that whiskey. It's really good. So a lot of innovation.
Great to taste soon, Trevor.
Yeah, please. I'd love to. Andrew Bemis asks, what has been your favorite and or most interesting wood to finish in?
Well, first of all, I'll say that, so we do a mixture of finishing and full term maturation. So actually sherry wood is important in that the whiskeys in there are not just finished in sherry casks. Some of the spirit in there went directly off of the still into sherry casks and touched nothing else. So and those give us kind of two different styles of sherry cask flavor, whereas a finish would be 3 years in new oak and then into casks for a couple more sherry casks for a couple more years. But so I've actually forgotten the plot of the original question.
Most interesting wood to finish in.
Most interesting wood to finish in. Okay, so besides the note on finishing, I mean, I really like interesting Sauterne style wines. I'm really pumped for these really innovative PX casks. Is going to take forever though to mature. But honestly, the big thing is Gary Oak. For us, we most of it is full term maturation, so straight off the still into the cask rather than finishing. But just because it, as an oak species, the chemistry and therefore the flavor profile is completely different from the American white oak, let alone any other species of oak in the world, and it's our local oak. We're just beginning to crack that open. I mean, a Gary Oak growing in the Seattle area versus British Columbia versus Oregon, South Slope, North Slope. I mean, there's so many variables there that we're just beginning to explore. Length of air drying in cask. So there's a lot of fun stuff there too. Wine casks, when they're really excellently, when they come through and everything is just right. There's not too much bitterness. There's not too much acidity. Wine casks do some really cool stuff. In fact, our next version of Garyana, which is coming out pretty soon, is a mixture of Gary Oak casks and wine casks, Washington State red wine casks. Garyana, I'm sorry, is is the whiskey release that uses these local oak, the Gary oaks. So so there's a lot of stuff there that we play with. I mean, I said before that we're really focused on barley and those varieties, but we focus on the casks too quite a bit.
All right. Jordan Racy says, of the 5 different Scotch whiskey regions, do you have a favorite and try to create similar taste to that region, or would you say you've created your own new region?
Great question. Not that the other questions aren't great, but it's just this question, like going to Scotland for me the first time, like I was learning how to make whiskey. I'd never been to Scotland. And when I went to Islay the first time, if any of you are not familiar with Islay, it's the island off the southwest coast of Scotland. It's famous for the peated whiskies. If you've been there, it's an amazing experience. But for those of you who haven't been there, when you get there, it's immediately different. Like you step off this plane and the air smells different. And you look around everywhere and it looks like you're on the moon. It's like there's no trees, by the airport anyways, there's like no trees, and it's just, it looks like it's barren, but it's just moss, and these big, peat bogs that are out there. And there's like sheep running across the road completely uncontrolled and all this other stuff. And when I went to Ireland, it was like March, and there was a big storm, and I was in this little bed and breakfast with like 18-inch thick walls. Rain is hitting the windows, and there was a peat fueled fire. They were using peat to keep the place warm, and it was like a 3-legged dog in the mix and a funny cat. And just sitting there and you're just drinking peated whiskey, and like the concept of sense of place, like I was like, oh, I get it. When I say sense of place, I mean like you are drinking something that is connected to the place where it comes from. And that's really, really powerful. You can get that in other parts of Scotland too, but I think Islay just has that magic. And for me, the important lesson from there was, I love this and I love what I'm experiencing. And I don't want to try to make Islay in Seattle. I want to do that for Seattle. I want to do that for the Pacific Northwest and for American single malt. And as a consequence, our whiskey making tries to reflect that in various ways. So Islay was the most important region for me that way.
I love that. That's awesome. I have not been, but you painted a great picture for
It's an amazing place.
All right, we got a couple more here. Courtney Knitter asks, what was the name of your first college distilled beverage, and how did that inspire you to create the name Westland?
Well, there's a huge gap in terms of quality of those two things, and my favorite. I don't remember what I first called it. I have the oldest remaining jar of stuff I made in college is in a mason jar, very like classically moonshiny, with a piece of blue painter's tape on it that just says unknown with 3 question marks behind it. And like I don't remember what it was, or like I don't want to open it anymore, and like I'm sure it smells and tastes terrible. But that that was a big. There's a lot of evolution that happened between there and Westland, and with Westland it was 2 things. One, it was the place where we first hatched our business plan to create the distillery. Happened in an old family home of my co-founder and his family. It was back when people used to name homes. It was that old. So the home was called Westland, but also we loved the idea of what we're trying to do is evocative of the Western ethos. And the West of America is certainly not always perfect, but there's a lot of really positive things that I love about living here. The way that we kind of approach life. It's an innovative part of the world. It's a part of the world where people can do new things and live their lives a certain way. And there's always this sense of possibility and optimism, and that, in any given time period. So that idea as a way to approach single malt whiskey seemed natural to us as people who grew up here. And the idea to be able to express that as the West, but not tied to like Seattle or Washington State or whatever. It's Westland. That's where we really like that idea. So that's where that came from.
Awesome. I will do one last question here. Again, I wish I could ask all the questions, but all right, this is like, I think this one is a good one to end on. What type, what will you miss most about the Sherrywood expression, and what do you look forward to the most in Westland's future?
So I'll say before I answer that, because I know there were a lot more questions, and I feel like if I could like type them and answer them in chat, or if Marshall could do that, I think we would. I think if you hit up Marshall or myself afterwards, we'd be happy to answer those questions for you guys, just for what it's worth, because it's awesome that people are asking so many questions. But we'd be happy to answer them for you in the future. But I mean, I think for me, the thing that I'm going to miss the most.
By all means, if there's a question you saw that you'd like to.
No. I'm just like, there's like, they're coming in, which is great.
I wish.
I think this is a good way to talk about, where we're going though, as well. It's a good segue.
I think for me, the thing that I miss the most about Sherrywood is that honestly, it's the PX part of it. The PX dimension that has this, yes, it has this raisin thing, but the savory, I remember like the Eureka cask one that we did originally, like 311, is one I still have a bottle of it in the blending lab, and I bring it down for people because it reminds me of Mole Poblano. And
for sure.
Just this, which I love, and that dimension of flavor is so unexplored and underappreciated, and the fact that PX can do that is really, really cool. And it will continue to do so, just in much smaller, just like we've done with your new single cask, which is PX. But the fact that Sherrywood was able to bring that to the table is something I'll miss, for sure. There was a second part to that question, I think, that I've missed.
Just what's the future hold for Westland? Like any sneak peeks of things or anything you're particularly excited about?
Well, a lot. I mean, besides the whole American single malt thing and that kind of coming to the table here as a category, the biggest new thing for us is this new peated whiskey, Solum, which is made with local peat. And the fun thing about that is what grows in our peat bogs is completely different from what grows in the peat bogs of Scotland. So the flavor in the peat is different. And it's great. Like the way that I describe it is like the flavor of the peat is like one part traditional. The flavor of Solum Edition 1, which is releasing in March, is like one part traditional peat phenolic. So there's kind of medicinal Band-Aid notes, one part mezcal, and one part kind of earthy, tobacco-y, forest floor, dried leaves sort of note. It's really, really cool. And this idea of exploring peat, the peated whiskey is the oldest style of whiskey in the world. Everything traces its lineage all the way back to people using peat as a fuel source to dry it. That's a pretty important thing for us, is to be able to unveil, American peat and use that and just open up that world of American single malt is super, super exciting.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of underscore that. Again, you guys can try the new flagship SKU that's been out for, about a year and a half now. And those are on all the bars. And that's really made way for us to have annual releases of these, the Gariana, the Solum coming up, and then Colere, which is our single barley variety, which I saw somebody ask about the Bread Lab and single barley varieties. Yeah. We could spend another hour on that. Oh, yeah. Frankly. So those are all going to be annual releases. So hopefully we can continue to, work together to get those in the bar with you guys as well. And each season, essentially, we've got something new coming out in addition to these private casts. So there's always something new in the pipeline for us.
Exciting stuff. All right, let's run through the questions really quick. We'll pick some winners, and then we'll do a final send-off cheers. All right, so we had the question about the water. We had the question about how much you're drinking over there at the distillery every day. We have the question about the most important elements of distilling. We have the question about which finish has a higher ceiling in the market space, the sherry barrel or the peated malt. Most interesting wood you guys use. The question about the 5 different Scotch regions and, trying to create your own thing versus replicate something that's already been done. We had the question about your first distilled beverage and kind of the name of Westland. And then the question about the what you're going to miss most about the sherry cask, and then also what's in what we can expect for the future. So any questions? You each choose one. I don't know if there's one that stands out to each of you, and then I'll choose the winner.
Marshall, that's you.
Let's see. I think Brian's question about the most important element between the raw ingredients, distilling and barrel aging was a good one. That's a good way for us to really, hit home on the fact that raw ingredients is very important to us, as you've seen. So is barrel aging, but that's something that really I think sets us apart from really most anybody else in the industry at this point. The raw ingredients thing. So I thought that was a really good question.
Cool. Matt, what was your favorite?
I was trying to use that as a way to get out of it.
Some time.
It's tough because these questions are all great.
Here and drink some more. That's fine with me.
Yeah. The problem is I need to run over to the cabinet over there and grab the whiskey because I sat down without giving myself a dram first, which is fucking amateur hour. No, I really appreciate it. My wife is like literally grabbing me like a bottle of whiskey.
The subtle hint was dropped. Life for the win. Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman.
Yes. So I think the question about the whiskey regions is a really good one because it probably wasn't the answer that you were expecting, but I think it was, and it wasn't either. When I went to Scotland, it was like, going to Islay is like going to the this is really the mecca of single malts. It's like you go to the center of it. This is where the soul of it lives. And the lesson that I got out of that was to not copy what they're doing, but to respect the fact that what they're doing is expressive of place, and to try to do that back home and do that for the US and for the West Coast is a really exciting thing to do, and a privilege and an honor to be able to do that. So I really like that question.
Awesome. All right. So my favorite out of those two questions, because it gave me all the feels, as they like to say, was definitely the question about the Scotch regions and just hearing about your experiences with Islay and trying to replicate the essence of the whiskey in the Pacific Northwest. And it gave, like I said, it gave me all the feels. So Jordan Racy, congratulations. We will have that 10-year anniversary bottle coming your way. Super jealous. And then second place was Brian Freeland. We have a really cool Westland swag package coming your way with a bunch of different cool things. And like I said, that we have that cask strength cask 2496 Pedro Jimenez sherry finish 118.8 proof. That's available for sale to our Whiskey Club members.
Full maturation, even cooler, which we touched on. Not a finish in this one. So again, super unique.
Full maturation. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. And then that amazing pick that I think was like back. I think we picked it back in like 2015 or 14 or something like that. Cask 311. I'm pretty sure a lot of our restaurants still have some bottles of that sitting back on the shelf.
They do.
So
yeah, that's kind of how I decided to stalk Trevor and track him down. I was like, there's somebody here who's a fan, and this is really good. So I'm gonna find this guy and connect with him.
And go visit Westland. Like I said, one of the most pristine, beautiful distilleries I've had the pleasure of visiting, and I've been to quite a few. So, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, Slanche. Appreciate everything you guys do, and it was a pleasure having you tonight. And
Likewise.
happy
Thank
Monday.
you. Thanks for having us. Thanks
for
everybody.
having us. Thank you, everybody who tuned in.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.